Hello, my name is Dave Poulton, Director of the Alberta Land Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Land Use 2021, a place for biodiversity offsets. I will be your moderator for today's session. This is truly a global event. We have about 400 people attending, representing over 20 countries. Welcome to all, and a special greetings and Ramadan Mubarak to everyone observing this holiest month in the Muslim calendar. I'd like to introduce you to the Alberta Land Institute. We are a nonprofit or nonpartisan land use policy research institute based at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta. Our research director, Iran Kaplinski, and I lead the institute. You can learn more about us by visiting the ALI Expo booth. The Expo link is on the left side of your screen. You can also access papers and materials relevant to today's presentations in the Expo area. We respectfully acknowledge that we at the University of Alberta are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. Today's session is entitled Putting Biodiversity Offsetting in its Place. We'll be asking the question, what is the place of offsetting for biodiversity in our development and conservation planning, and examining the special challenges of offsetting with respect to endangered species, marine environments, and protected areas. To help you get the most out of today's event, I'd like to give you a bit of an orientation to this hop-in platform, which we have selected to give you as interactive experience as possible. You can submit questions for our presenters at any time through the Q&A tab on the upper right-hand side of your screen. I will be monitoring that and relaying questions to the presenters. Given our large numbers today, I may not be able to get to all the questions. You can indicate which questions are of most interest to you by clicking the thumbs up icon to the right of the question. Please use the comment tab on the upper right for more general comments that may not be directed to our presenters. Please note that both of these are visible to all and are not anonymous. We'll be using the polls tab in the same upper right-hand corner to get responses from you in today's session and to help with our planning of future sessions. You can see who else is participating today through the Participants tab, and there you can send direct messages and arrange to connect one-on-one with other participants. So let me get to today's speakers. I encourage you to read each of the speakers' biographies located below on this stage screen. I will keep my introductions concise, therefore. Today we welcome David Brown, Director of Conservation for the Canadian Wildlife Federation, a nonprofit conservation organization based in Canada, Ontario. Céline Jacob is an environmental geographer with Vertigo Lab based in Bordeaux, France. She recently completed a postdoctoral position in Montreal at the Université de Québec Notaoué. Rita Kagonia is a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, looking at the realities of biodiversity offsetting in developing countries. And to lead today's sessions, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Martine Maron. Dr. Maron is joining us from Brisbane, Australia, where she is Professor of Environmental Management at the University of Queensland. She helped draft the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Biodiversity Offset Policy and chairs the new IUCN thematic group on impact mitigation and environmental compensation. As the author of some of the most cited academic articles on when offsetting is and is not appropriate, she's an ideal leader for our session today. Martine, please join us, and I will turn the session over to you.
Thank you. Good morning here in Brisbane. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever everybody is. I'm going to attempt to do a screen share, and let's see how we go. Okay. Now, I'm pretty sure that's going to be in the wrong mode, so I'm just going to switch things around. Okay. Dave, does that look okay now? hoping it does because I can't hear anybody.
Yes, it does. Yeah, I think you're good to go, Martine. Thanks.
Oh, good. Thanks very much. Every time I use a new platform, it takes a little bit. And there have been so many new platforms over the last 12 months. Look, thanks, Dave, for the fantastic introduction. Thanks to everybody at the Alberta Land Institute for putting together this really exciting series of presentations, which I'm really looking forward to over the coming weeks, especially over the coming weeks, once I've got the anxiety of this first presentation out of the way. You know, we had so hoped to all be together in person in Canada last year. And given that that's not to be, given the global circumstances, I think that this series of webinars is the perfect consolation prize. So I'm really looking forward to this. And before I get started, I also just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm presenting from today here in Brisbane. That's the Yagara and Turrbal people, and acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and their custodianship of the land here for millennia, which was rather more successful than the custodianship that is the subtext to a lot of the discussions today. And although our discussions are about offsetting and regulation and policy, my first love is birds. And I think that, you know, a love of nature is what drives many of us to this topic. And so I wanted to start by introducing the Regent honeyeater. This is a native Australian bird, and it used to be really common in Eastern Australia. The idea that once people would have seen huge flocks, hundreds of these glorious birds, is just sort of breathtaking. I've seen 3 of them in my entire life, and that's unusual. There's only a handful of them left, and it's not surprising because the landscapes where they lived have been so very transformed. They unfortunately lived where we also want to live and grow food and dig coal and put all of our infrastructure. And the Regent honeyeater, of course, is one of a million species facing the same sorts of fate, and many of those that fate is caused by many of the very, very similar pressures. So now only a few hundred of these birds are left, and you know that's the very brink of extinction. And yet we still place pressure on them. So we still are seeking to remove their habitat for industrial development, for mining and for infrastructure. And this is a really common story around the world. These are really important drivers of biodiversity loss. But we do have something up our sleeves here, because infrastructure and industrial development projects that might impact biodiversity, they are a threat to biodiversity that we sort of have direct control. And by we, I mean humanity broadly, but often specifically regulators. So as opposed to things like wildlife disease or invasive species, we're making a direct decision when we choose to remove habitat or to have an impact through these sorts of developments. And that means that we can also set up processes and procedures to guide how we make those decisions and hopefully make them a little bit more wisely. So the mitigation hierarchy is an approach that I think perhaps almost everyone online is going to be very familiar with, but just in case to quickly run through it, if we imagine that in that landscape, some of that Regent honeyeater habitat is entirely hypothetically in the way of a proposed coal mine. This would potentially have a certain scale of negative biodiversity impact. And so the first step in the mitigation hierarchy then is to seek to avoid that impact as much as possible. Can this—
Martine, sorry to interrupt you, but your slides don't appear to be advancing.
That's good, actually. So the animations on the version I sent to you might be a bit glitchy. Sorry about that in advance, but we'll see how we go. So hopefully now people can see the bird that I was talking about. And if you click again, you'll be able to see the landscape also that I was talking about. Kathleen, yeah, and how transformed it really is. And yet those little patches of habitat are still under threat. So if you can click a couple more times, then that will take us, and so Yeah, this was my point about us having an opportunity to put in place a process that actually controls the decisions we make. So the next slide is the mitigation hierarchy, and there's no need to worry that people couldn't see that before, because I think people are very familiar with it. So essentially, if we think about that habitat being potentially lost for our region honeyeaters, we first need to seek to avoid that impact. If for some reason it's deemed unavoidable, at least minimising the footprint of that impact is the next step. For areas that might only be subject to temporary disturbance, we can then move to the next step in the hierarchy, which is restore or remediate. And then only for any impacts that remain after that and that are deemed sort of unavoidable, those residual impacts are where we start to move to the stage of offsetting. Next slide, please. And so the idea of offsetting, and there's a few animations in this, so perhaps just bring them all up. The idea is to attempt to at least counterbalance the negative impacts on biodiversity, those ones that remain after we have been through all the steps in the mitigation hierarchy. And the idea is that the counterbalancing gains that we might generate have to be at least equivalent to the losses, the impacts that that development has caused. So equivalent means that they need to be the same type. So if it's regent honeyeater habitat that's being lost, it's got to be regent honeyeater habitat that is gained to counterbalance that loss. It also has to be the same amount of habitat as that was lost, at least. And it needs to be gained for at least the same duration as that loss. Okay, next slide. So there's a series of ways in which we might do that. And so how we generate these gains depends on the biodiversity we're targeting. So it might be through doing habitat restoration or enhancement, managing specific threats in particular areas, or protecting habitat that already exists. And there are lots of different mechanisms that might require this to be done. So government policy might require offsets, and that's certainly the case here in Australia, where pretty much every jurisdiction has some form of offsetting policy, offsetting requirement, as does the Commonwealth Government. Financiers might have controls on the lending that they do, such that they require a no net loss outcome from projects to which they lend, or there may just be corporate policies that require the mitigation hierarchy to be followed. Next session, and there's a lot of different ways that offsets are delivered as well. So it could be that the proponent of the development actually themselves does the work to deliver that counterbalancing gain, or they might pay someone else to do it. They might be able to purchase sort of off-the-shelf biodiversity credits in the market, or they might be able to contribute funds to essential sort of funds like a trust that then goes out and purchases or pays somebody else to develop the biodiversity benefits that are required. Next slide. So if we bring up all this text on this one, essentially there's a series of things that we want to achieve when we're doing offsetting. The point of it is to disincentivize environmental impacts and to essentially limit any impacts to those that can actually be counterbalanced. So it sort of should set a limit, essentially a no net loss limit to destruction. It's a way of, I guess, internalizing that cost of biodiversity loss. And it bases that on the replacement cost. You know, the cost that you pay as a developer is whatever it costs to replace the biodiversity that's destroyed. So most importantly, what we're required to achieve through offsetting is at least a no net loss outcome, at least no net loss relative to change without those regulated developments or the ones that are affected by offsets. Next slide. So the problem is, of course, that offsetting is really controversial and lots of people don't like it. And there's actually really good reasons for that, because offsetting is being done pretty poorly in most cases. It's really hard to find fantastic examples where you say, yes, this ticks all the boxes. And there's a whole lot of different reasons, 5 in fact, I think, if keep clicking, thank you. These are they, and these are what I wanted to try to talk about in the rest of this talk. Now, so I was asked to talk a bit about the sort of limits to offsets, and once I started trying to summarise what these were, I discovered that there's vastly too much for one short talk. And so I'm going to go reasonably quickly through some of these points, but I think for all of them there are some sort of references to some further reading that may give a bit more background. And also I know that other speakers today are going to expand on several of these. Next slide. So let's have a look at some of these. Like when I talk about the frame of reference, we are interested in, okay, when we say we want a no net loss outcome, no net loss compared to what? So we might imagine that we have some biodiversity, let's say region honeyeater habitat, and it's declining over time, partly due to development impacts. And then if we click, we have an offset policy that we want to introduce. We might imagine that no net loss would achieve this outcome. We would stop that decline. But that's not what offset policies are generally designed to do. If we click again, instead, we envisage that there's some component of decline that would be happening even without those particular development impacts, so some other things that are driving habitat decline, which would mean that a successful application of that policy, it just removes the development impacts component and so matches the rate of decline that we've made an assumption is there in the background. So this is clearly a more complicated sort of an outcome than, a more complicated definition of no net loss than we might imagine on the face of it. So immediately there's some difficulties here, and people might not be particularly comfortable with this as a definition of no net loss. So I've got some animations in the following slides, which you could just click through, Kathleen, thank you, to just sort of show what this looks like. You've got unregulated impacts happening, grazing, so on, degrading a forest, but then you've got regulated impacts like this power line easement going through. And this impact might be required to have an offset. So the offset in this case might be to protect the forest adjacent and remove the cattle. So if you keep clicking through. And so the idea is essentially, I'll just wait for the animations to catch up a little bit. The idea is essentially that you've got no further degradation happening in that part of the forest. So if you keep clicking through, you can see that essentially we still have less habitat after the power line easement than before. So it's relative no net loss, not absolute no net loss. So this is called averted loss offsetting. The idea being that it prevents some future losses in exchange for allowing other losses, such as the regulated development. And so this approach to offsetting is very, very common, but you can see it also relies on there being those other ongoing threats so that you can prevent them and create a benefit. Okay, next slide. So a few lessons from this. We need to think really carefully about what that net outcome is that we actually want. Do we want to just maintain background rates of decline, or do we want to stop all decline? If we really want to stop all decline, then we need to remember that means that you don't get any credit for just protecting habitat that's already there. And so if that's what you're interested in, then it may be that you want a different form of compensation than offsets. So there's some work that this awesome group of people funded by the Science for Nature and People Partnership did. And there's a link there to a video that explains that and a paper at the bottom there. I'm not going to go into this, but it's essentially an alternative way to do compensation that achieves conservation targets or aligns with conservation targets rather than that more traditional approach to offsetting that I've just described that matches whatever we think the background change is. Okay, next. So there are also a whole lot of absolute limits to offsetting. Even if we say, okay, we really want to focus on creating benefits, actual benefits, not just protecting what's there. We want to do restoration. And so that's potentially a much more positive way to look at offsetting, but this is really easier said than done. So, for example, there's a whole lot of things that we can probably do pretty well. So this is a growling grass frog on our farm in Western Victoria, and we were able to recreate some habitat for that species really quite quickly. It uses artificial habitat easily. So that's good. We could do that quickly and reliable. This next species, though, this is a Southeastern red-tailed black cockatoo. These birds rely on really, really old trees. We can grow the trees, you know, we know how to do it, but it takes hundreds of years to create the trees these birds like. So we can't just replace that. And then in this final example, you know, a lot of the drier ecosystems in Australia, woodlands, we just don't have evidence that we can sort of recreate them, certainly not from a very degraded state or essentially a cleared field. So if we move to the next slide, there's a few things out of this. You know, we need to remember when we're designing these approaches that in most cases, recreating lost biodiversity is at least really hard, and often we actually can't do it. We don't have evidence that we can do it, and we should expect it to cost a lot of money. So we shouldn't rely on restoration approaches that aren't proven to counterbalance certain and immediate losses of important biodiversity. Restoration offsetting is probably most effective in cases where you've got maybe a particular species that's pretty clearly defined rather than an entire complex ecosystem that you're trying to replace. When you know you can do really quick, effective replacement of habitat. And I need prompts for the last one. Oh yeah. And also if the impact site that's being lost that you're trying to counterbalance is itself not in very good condition. So you're counterbalancing something that's not a pristine ecosystem. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so then we move on to the technical design of offsetting. And there are a whole lot of issues here. I'm going to touch on them only really briefly. But there are a lot of calculation approach fails about where the way that we calculate, well, how much gain do we need so that we can counterbalance a loss is flawed. So it may be focusing on site condition only. So you might go to a site and say, okay, this is a potential offset site. It's in really good condition. It'll be a great offset, but that's not necessarily the case. All we care about is how much gain can we achieve, because it's only the gain that should count. So that means having some sort of a counterfactual scenario against which we estimate that gain. What would have happened at this potential offset site if we didn't make it an offset? But those assumptions are often implicit or, you know, poorly thought through. And the way that they tend to be thought through is has the effect of overestimating the risk of loss of that site if we didn't call it an offset, which in turn increases the estimated amount of benefit from the site. And so you end up with a trade of a loss for actually a small gain, thinking it's a large gain. There are a whole lot of other things, uncertainty and time lags, and also the way that we actually measure the particular elements of biodiversity. It's one thing if we have separate metrics for each species or ecosystem we care about, but in a lot of cases, if we click the next point, there are situations where a lot of different things that we care about, different biota, are combined into one single metric. You know, which makes it easier to trade across different places, and then you get unintended substitutions and lots of things you care about. So I might just click really quickly through the lessons here that we obviously need to think carefully about the way that we do these calculations. Build in reality checks, make sure that the assumptions we're making have some basis in evidence, and separate that accounting so that we make sure we are counting losses and gains for each thing that we want to achieve no net loss for. Next slide. Okay. Now, let's say that we've worked out the frame of reference, the appropriate outcome that we want from offsetting. We've made sure we stay within ecological limits in terms of what we're asking it to do for us. We've got a really good calculation approach. What next? How is it actually going? You know, are they working on the ground? And if not, why not? The answer is it's really hard to know. It's actually really difficult to get really good implementation data about a lot of offsets. So a lot of offsets are sort of examined as one-off things. So getting data is difficult, but where these things have been looked at. So Elena May in Western Australia looked at the offsets under the Western Australian system and found that 30% of the offsets weren't even implemented appropriately. So their effectiveness couldn't be evaluated because they weren't even done. a project led by David Lindenmayer looked at the nest boxes that were put up to replace hollow trees for a highway widening in Australia, and found that within just 3 years, 10% of those had collapsed and were unusable, and there was no plan to maintain those into the future. So you can see it's not going to take very long before there's really nothing left, and the hollows are long gone. So that's a problem for all those hollow dwelling species that used to rely on those. And Sofa Suamgasin has led a really great review of offsets that do report outcomes, and essentially 2/3 of those said they failed to achieve no net loss. So we're not doing a great job. So what can we learn? The lessons are that, firstly, I think a lot of the problems, at least that I see in Australia, are that the way that conditions of approval are written and that offsets are written into those conditions of approval, they often just say there will be an offset. Maybe a little more than that. There will be an offset plan developed down the track, etc. And that's really kicking the can down the road. The problem is the approval for the impact is given, the impact occurs, and then we start the real detailed work of understanding what has to be done to do a good offset. And maybe that's the point at which we discover it's really hard, or it's really expensive and we want to change the conditions, and this happens. So we really need to get very clear about requiring the specific outcomes of offsets to be written into the conditions of approval. And we need to be monitoring and evaluating and reporting regularly, and including the cost of that, because it's expensive, but without doing it, we don't know what we're achieving. And a really great first step would be, you know, ideally before an offset scheme starts, set up a publicly accessible register that includes the information about all of this stuff and report on outcomes regularly. And that would start to build public confidence in the transparency of the system. Okay. So this is the last category of thing that I wanted to talk about. And this is a bit fuzzier, I suppose. So even if we could get that implementation right within the offsets program, there tends to be a lot of perhaps unintended or unexpected impacts on the system more broadly. And I guess by the system, I just mean the existing environmental management, biodiversity management sort of world. So there's this, just having offsets as part of the policy mix has some really interesting consequences, some of which are really worrying. So for example, I talked about offsets that involve protecting existing land. Having these sorts of offsets is sort of provides a bit of an incentive to maintain risk of loss to sites, to maintain that background rate of decline. So if we click for the next things, essentially it's because the greater the risk that a site might be lost, the more gain we can claim that we get by calling it an offset. So the smaller and cheaper an offset can be for any given impact. Also, other conservation actions that, say, government might want to invest in, it sort of reduces the availability of offset credits because they're sort of, you know, intervening and purchasing benefits, but not for offsets, reducing their availability. And it might sound like this is just, you know, really taking things a bit far, but I'm aware of 2 separate cases where the removal of native vegetation protections in Queensland were promoted by the politicians in charge as a really good opportunity, because that previously protected vegetation, now no longer protected, could now be sold. The protection could now be sold as an offset credit in exchange for destruction elsewhere, which is obviously a real perversity that we would want to avoid. Okay, next. Okay, what else? Now, a lot of biodiversity management happens on public land, on private land, and a lot of landholders for a long time have been managing that biodiversity sort of for free because they care. The problem is that now that there are companies around offering funds to landholders to do good works, to do biodiversity benefits on their properties and pay them, you know, people may think, well, maybe I should just wait, not do that now, wait to get paid, you know, and fair enough. But that's not just individuals that applies to. So environmental charities also always looking for money to do the good works that they do. Pretty tempting. I mean, who knows where the money's exactly coming from in some cases. the thing is that offset delivery is provision of a service to a commercial entity that, in most cases, that entity is required to provide. And if they don't provide it, if the charity or the landholder doesn't provide it, they would simply have to go elsewhere. So there is a really fundamental difference between the work that someone does in aid of providing an offset benefit compared to the general voluntary additional conservation benefits they may have done otherwise. And they may not understand, and that might be fine. That might be a choice that they're perfectly willing to make. But in a lot of cases, volunteers, indeed charities, might not really understand that difference. Okay, so next. Oh yeah. And so there are some, again, examples of this really happening. And in fact, examples that are even more egregious than sort of what I described. So there was this case in the Australian Capital Territory where volunteers, a community group, had restored, had revegetated a public park in this case. And then years later, the benefits of that revegetation were claimed as an offset for the destruction of other nearby woodland, which obviously, caused people to be not very happy about that. So there's this real impact on the volunteer culture. Next. Okay. So this is a big one, and I'm hoping that Rita is going to comment on this because I don't have time to go into it all that much. But once you start seeing these flows of money to purchase benefits in the form of offsets, it's potentially going to displace other expenditure. And a really obvious example of that is how tempting it is to use that money to purchase new protected areas and for a state to therefore say, as in a nation to say, there we go, we committed to having, say, 17% protected areas, or maybe we'll move to 30%. And look, here's some money, we can use this to help achieve it. The problem is that if it's already promised, then this money isn't really buying an additional benefit. And the little flow chart there is from one of those papers that are listed that sort of steps through when it might be acceptable for this to occur and when it's not acceptable. So we want to be really wary that offsets aren't replacing conservation spending that otherwise would have happened anyway, because then that's essentially double counting. So this is sort of, reaching into other areas where you hear people talking about money from offsets as an opportunity for innovative finance of generation of environmental benefits. But of course, this is really awkward because it's linked to the destruction of that same biodiversity. And so you end up having this risk of developing a reliance on offset generated funds generated that are only generated because of biodiversity destruction. And also a positive sort of spin on offsets that focuses only on the gain and not on the fact that that gain is counterbalancing an equivalent loss. And so the net outcome is not actually a positive, it's neutral by definition. Next. And this is the final one I wanted to touch on, and this is some work that was led also by Sophus Zoam-Gasson, which was a really interesting analysis. We've heard increasing rhetoric around the idea that, when you set up a market so that people requiring offset credits can go to the market and purchase those benefits to counterbalance their losses, they find they're often really hard to find for particular biodiversity. There's lots of different types of biodiversity. It's not just, carbon equivalents. It's extremely diverse, and that means that there can be really low volume of trades and high prices, and seen as a bad thing. It's seen as a market failure when that happens. And so then regulators might decide, okay, well, we want to change the trading rules to make these things more flexible. Maybe we allow one species to be exchanged for another or one ecosystem for another. Increase the trading volume, and that has a whole lot of different implications, though. The problem is that the whole point of the market is to achieve a no net loss outcome. And part of that is done by allowing the scarcity of availability of certain biodiversity credits to be evident. So this increase in flexibility in response to an illiquid market actually undermines the scarcity signal that needs to be there for the market to achieve its actual purpose, which is, remember, to incentivize avoidance, incorporate the true cost of biodiversity loss into doing business and ultimately achieve no net loss. So often this idea that the market needs to be functioning, and that's the point we forget. The only reason the market exists is to achieve these outcomes, and manipulating the parameters of the market, if they undermine these outcomes, is sort of pointless. Okay, so there's too many lessons to list. I've just listed a few high-level ones, but essentially we're really just now getting clarity on all of these different things, sorry, just on the previous slide, that can possibly be caused by introducing offsets to a system. So we really need to think about these risks before we introduce a program and implement safeguards, and be really vigilant against greenwash and crowding out and displacement of other funds. And transparency is really key to that. So to wrap up, essentially we have a really long road to travel before we get offset. So if we just click to the text, we have a lot to do. There are a lot of failures out there, but we can learn from those failures. We're constantly reviewing policy. New policies are being developed all the time. So we can use that to make the policy more robust, and we have to, because there really aren't many alternatives if we're actually going to halt biodiversity decline while allowing some development to continue. So thank you. And with that, I just want to leave you with the final slide that just shows you the link if you would like to join the thematic group via the Commission on Ecosystem Management, and also a link to some short little videos that we've developed that I have not even launched yet, so nobody else has had a chance to see them, but have a look. They step through some of those concepts that I've just talked about. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Martine. That was obviously a very quick run through a very complicated landscape. So we had lots of concepts covered. And thank you, Kathleen, for stepping in with the technical support in our time of need. We have had a question come in, but given the little delay we had, I think it might be best to leave questions till the end when we have the whole panel assembled. Although I am I certainly encourage our participants to submit their questions at any time, again on the Q&A tab in the upper right of your screen. Our next speaker is David Brown with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. David, please take it away.
Great, thanks David, from one David to another. Let me see if I can share my screen successfully. Here we go. Bear with me. So now you see me again. I think that should be working. And hopefully when I dance. So thank you very much. First of all, an honor to follow Martine. Excellent talk, and nice to see a whole bunch of thoughts that I have had and haven't had around this issue just coalesced into a single talk. That was excellent. And thanks to Dave Poulton for pushing ahead with this. And it really is too bad that we couldn't do this in Banff either last year or this year. So I'm going to present some thinking coming from Canada. I'm based here in Ottawa, in the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. It's a nice sunny afternoon here in Ottawa, and it's budget day in the country of Canada today. So we all find out what the next COVID spending will be. So my talk is really based on conversations that have happened over the last 8 years around some species at risk forums that I've had the opportunity to be a part of. And I wanted to acknowledge as well that this thinking draws on work from Alison Woodley of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, and we're also working with IUCN, and of Scott Finley, a professor at University of Ottawa, who put some thought into this a number of years ago. And so over a period of about 2011 to 2018, through a number of forums, we had the opportunity to talk between industry, environmental groups, and the federal government around issues like offsets under the Species at Risk Act in Canada, and I'll present some perspectives around that. So the three things I want to focus on, and you'll see that this does hopefully draw well and follow well from what Martine had to say, is one, that applicability to species at risk is by nature going to be limited, that where offsets are found to be applicable, their use would have to be driven by the recovery strategy and subject to a much higher burden of proof than what we would put in place for an offset system for common species. And that not all activities are able to be offset. And so when they cannot be and the species is jeopardized, it must be transparent that a decision was taken to harm the species. So first to go into, and I should say in the background are some Canadian species that offsets are either being used for or talked about. And this is the Blandings turtle in the back here. So why will it be limited? And I'll go into each of these 3 points. I mean, species at risk, as anyone would know that works with them, you're really working within the risk level of impacts that are not able to be offset. And I'll explain that. Some types of tools are not likely applicable. So in lieu fees and averted loss in particular are controversial and likely not consistent with recovery in most cases. And just the basic knowledge of the biology of species and restoration techniques is poor. So first off, high risk, to quickly run through this, taking the diagram from Pilgrim et al. 2013, put this nice diagram together with biodiversity conservation concern increasing as you go to the right on the bottom axis, and the likelihood of an offset actually succeeding increasing as you go up on the left axis there. And so places where it might be great to experiment with offsets and try to reach success for species would be in the upper left-hand corner, and places where you probably don't want to apply an offset program would be down in the bottom right. So just a couple of factors around species at risk in general, and certainly those in Canada, like the one in the background here, the boreal woodland caribou, is in many cases there's little or no evidence that we can restore the habitat or reintroduce the species successfully. So in terms of the likelihood of offset success, we're down in the lower to not possible level. Also, these species often either have long generation times or they require mature old growth habitats that would take a long time to restore or even create. So we end up trying to create offsetting systems when we're working with species at risk that are in kind of that middle to right-hand bottom corner of this figure from Pilgrim, which is sort of high conservation concern, low likelihood of success, which poses a challenge. So another aspect of the limitations when we're dealing with species at risk is fewer offset tools. And in the conversations between 2011 and 2018, there was really a lot of pushback from the environmental community on in lieu fees as a payment, really seen as a payment for net loss and not as an offset. I mean, I'm open to examples of where in lieu fees could be used successfully to recover a species, but we didn't arrive at one in the conversations we had. And averted loss really came down to this underlying factor that Martine just elaborated on, which is that it assumes a declining habitat baseline and would really only be applicable in very specific scenarios, particularly those where there's just an abundance of available habitat for this species at risk. And so there can be decline over time and you can still reach your recovery objectives. So fewer offset tools and also limited knowledge. So basic biology of many species is not known, thus the uncertainty is very high. So one example would be just completely missing information. For example, 38% of the recovery strategies in Canada have no information on population trend. Now that's a number from 2015, I believe, but you can see we may know something about how many there are, maybe where they occur, but nothing beyond that. There's also high uncertainty. So to take an example of a species at risk that exists close to Edmonton, the rainbow trout Athabasca populations, there's a Department of Fisheries and Oceans recovery potential assessment document from 2018 that has this great end to its executive summary, where it says, you know, they've done all these calculations and they say a number of key sources of uncertainty exist for this species related to its life history parameters, population connectivity and abundance estimates, the quantity and quality of the available habitat, and the potential impacts of threat mitigations. In other words, all the things that we would like to have some certainty around in order to determine the recovery potential, we don't have certainty around. Despite that, there are some offset considerations for this species in the Athabasca that people are trying to work with. So how could this work? So through these discussions, particularly in 2013 and 14, when we were in working groups with industry like the Mining Association of Canada and FPAC, some credit to Kate Lindsay and Ben Chalmers, who was with the Mining Association at the time, and some others. We tried to figure out how could this work, and it really relates to some of the thinking that, and the shortcomings that Martine just spoke about, and I guess was in line with this new target-based compensation. And that's that you'd have to embed offsetting in and make it contingent upon the recovery strategy and action plan process. That's our process in Canada. At the federal level, it's a two-stage process to move towards recovery. And you'd have to have effective and enforceable monitoring and evaluation. So what would this look like? A recovery strategy would have to clearly define the recovered state and the milestones to get there. So that's your framework. That's your point of reference. This is where you want to go. That's what you're building. You're using your offset program as one of the tools in the toolbox to get to this recovered state. It's not the only tool. It's just one of them, and it has to be considered together with the others. And the recovery strategy is a science document, so it would assess the applicability of offsets and weigh in on whether they are applicable or not. It would do that through looking at a number of criteria, like do the techniques exist that provide certainty that you could restore habitat successfully or reintroduce the species? Or criteria like, are there opportunities for both impact and offset that exist within the same conservation unit, so you can work towards net gain in an offset program? You then put in place an action plan. This is where the rubber hits the road. It's the implementation part of Canada's Species at Risk program. So that would set out the framework for an offset program as a means of achieving recovery for the species. It would set criteria for permitting, designate and describe acceptable techniques. It would have to be a living document that added to those techniques and refine them over time. And it would set the standards for monitoring and evaluation to move us towards. So really thinking about offsetting not as a means of facilitating permitting, but as an actual tool for achieving recovery and making it work within that framework. So to come back to my question at the beginning, can offsets be used to achieve recovery objectives for species at risk? In theory, yes, I believe they could be. I think many environmental groups and conservation organizations have pursued research and case studies and pilot projects on certain species and believe that there might be opportunity here, but it is really in very specific cases under strict conditions where the benefit is clearly quantifiable and it's consistent with the recovery objective. Unfortunately, as Martine pointed out, at present the weight of evidence globally is that offset programs may slow, but do not really prevent declines in habitat and populations. We don't achieve no net loss, and that's particularly problematic for species at risk. Despite that, here in Canada, Ontario is currently issuing overall benefit permits, that's what it's called, that purport to offset harm using a variety of techniques, all of the ones which Martine listed. And DFO is currently issuing Species at Risk Act permits that are contingent on offsets. And this is one where I find it particularly promising. So the species in the background on this slide is the red-side dace. And there is an offset related permit out there for a highway interchange expansion that seems to work quite well on paper. And this is because the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and other partners have invested in the science behind this species. So they know the characteristics of the habitat that's needed. They know where the critical habitat is. They even know that much of it is in a poor state, to one of Martine's point. And there are opportunities out there for improving critical habitat that's in a poor state and moving it into a better state and moving towards recovery. So there's really, the information is out there for this sort of recovery strategy-based approach to offsetting. It's just not actually built out in that way in Canada in the Species at Risk Act. So to summarize, a couple of key ending points is that really offsetting for species at risk should not be seen as a means of facilitating permitting for activities that harm species. Offsetting should be developed as a means for achieving recovery, coupled with non-regulatory actions to reduce threats and protect and restore habitat. And yes, this puts the non-regulatory voluntary stuff in competition with this regulatory and permitting related work. And we need to figure out how to make that function in a positive way as opposed to the negative examples that Martine gave. And finally, back to that initial point that really not all impacts, especially when we're dealing with species at risk, are able to be offset. And we don't want greenwashing of this. So when they cannot be and the species is jeopardized, we really have to be transparent about net loss situations. And the language needs to change and the legal tools should be different and they should be consistent with failing to protect and recover the species. And so I'll leave you with this picture, which is Canada's most biodiverse habitat from a plant perspective. It's called Carolinian Forest. It exists in southern Ontario. It's the place where I grew up running around and playing around as a kid in the Niagara Peninsula. And it's a very hard piece of Canadian habitat to destroy and reestablish. So thanks very much.
Thanks, David. That was great. I think our next presenter is Celine Jacob. And I believe as a safeguard, we are going to have Kathleen advancing slides for Celine as well, just to make sure that everything goes smoothly.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Kathleen. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how we can improve the implementation of marine offsets through a pragmatic approach. So this presentation is based on an article that was published last year and written by myself, Jean-Vilain van Boschov, and his colleagues from the Biodiversity consultancy. So you can go on next slide, please. So ocean resources are currently recognized as crucial to address future challenges such as food, climate, energy, and raw materials. But this takes place in a context where biodiversity erosion is evident in over 3/4 of marine areas under national jurisdictions and nearly 2/3 of all oceanic systems. Next slide, please. In this context, we can see an increase of uptake of marine offsets as existing and emerging national mitigation policies are increasingly recognizing the potential of marine biodiversity offset. And studies of the efficacy of marine offset are scarce and patchy compared to terrestrial and freshwater ecosystem. And this might be due to a number of factors, including real or perceived implementation difficulty, paucity of data to inform management, but also complexity of monitoring and enforcement, and a limited understanding of impacts. So next slide. So I'm sure you know that there are a few differences between marine and terrestrial environment jurisdiction. But within the national jurisdictions, many countries are struggling to enforce their governance, and they struggle to protect their marine resources. And last, perception of impacts is quite different, as all impacts most impacts are occurring beneath the surface. And as you may know, out of sight, out of mind. This might explain why there is a low public expectation for offset application. So despite all these differences, fundamental offset principle, types, and approaches apply equally on land and at sea. So I will go through the different types of offset and their potential in the marine environment. So there are some opportunities for averaged loss type offset, as only 7.3% of the world oceans are currently under some form of protection. So it can be an opportunity to support effective management of marine protected areas in countries that are lacking funding. If you look at the overlay of marine protected areas with likely and potential critical habitats, nearly half of areas of high biodiversity significance are currently not receiving any formal protection. So this can be also seen as a potential for implementing offset. And as mentioned by Martine before, we have to be aware of a risk of cost shifting regarding this type of offset. I just put the example of the Port of Rotterdam expansion. Offsets, that is the creation of protected seabed that would prevent the bottom trawling. So next slide, please. So regarding opportunities for restoration offset, they are seen as promising, but only a few tried and tested techniques can be widely applied. So this figure on the left side of the slide summarizes the potential for undertaking a restoration offset for different types of marine ecosystems. So most existing marine restoration literature concerns ecosystem engineers such as kelp, coral, and biogenetic reef. In sufficient quantities, these structuring species can support restoration of ecosystem functioning. But of course, there are limits to what can be restored. And this is especially the case for cold water corals and hydrothermal vent communities. Next slide, please. What are the potential for policy-based offsets? So they can support changes in policy and practice that have a positive impact on target biodiversity. They have little application to date, but they have good potential for migratory and wide-ranging species that face a multitude of marine threats across the range. So I just put the example of, sorry, but still the other slide. I put the example of turtle excluder devices on industrial fishing fleets that could be used as offset for project impacts to sea turtles. There's also potential for policy-based intervention aiming at reducing land-based pollution, and they should promote better agricultural or waste management policies. So next slide, please. So if we want to improve the implementation of marine offset, what would be the implication for conservation policy and practice? So I will go through different examples of how we can improve that. So first, there's a need for robust marine spatial conservation planning. It means that we need to identify priority conservation and or restoration areas to inform avoidance, because we need to reduce the need of offset. So we need also to move away from a siloed project by project approach, and for issues shared on a regional scale, we can pool offset for better efficiency. And next. So practice at the project level also needs to evolve. So it means that marine impact assessment needs to be undertaken at spatial and temporal scales that are broad enough to account for ecological characteristics of the marine environment. We also need to better account for cumulative impacts and for land-sea interface. This might go through a wider application of strategic environmental assessment approaches. Then next slide, please. We also need better knowledge and data. This would go through proper characterization of the impacts, baseline, and counterfactuals, relying on a robust monitoring beyond the scope of individual projects. And I just put the example of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive in Europe that establishes a monitoring program that gives us ongoing assessment of different indicators of the good environmental status of marine waters. Use of modeling and new technology to support collection of large volumes of data at reduced cost. And then next slide. So last but not least, we really need to improve national ocean governance initiatives and the inclusion of local stakeholders. This means that public engagement and stakeholders' involvement is needed to generate awareness about project impacts, but also about the mitigation hierarchy. We need to identify limits to what can be offset through consultative processes, and this is particularly the case for deep sea mining, where acceptable limits may need to be based on social agreement. So such public engagement should be anchored to broader processes linked to ocean governance, especially concerning the high seas, where the design of an internationally binding instrument is crucial for framing future development activities. So just to sum up, so you can go to the next slide, sorry. So we need a more effective marine mitigation and offset mechanism, but would go hand in hand with addressing challenges currently faced by marine conservation policy. But we also need to move beyond the environmental impact assessment process. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, these results are based on the review article, which is mentioned on the right side of the slide. Thank you very much for your attention. Thanks, Kathleen.
Okay, thanks, Celine, and thank you again, Kathleen. And our final speaker for today is Rita Kagonia, joining us from Norway. Hello, Rita.
Hello, thank you, Deb. And thank you for having me to share my views and my research findings on this platform. I'm going to mainly concentrate on offsetting in protected areas. That is the area that I am mainly researching on, and this is specifically in the developing country context. So when we look at, or when we talk about offsetting in protected areas, it is a little contested, just as Martine talked about the aspects of cost shifting, having perverse incentives. So when I looked at the case studies in Uganda, of course, we have so many aspects to consider, but I'll share some of the views and some of the findings that we got right there. So offsetting in developing countries is mainly a voluntary activity. It's the voluntary offsetting which is desired by the development partners or the funders, and not necessarily as a result of policies designed to ensure that people offset in that particular country. So some of these countries have, I would say, a lot of pressure on their natural resources, and yet they do not have funding, or they don't have capacity in their institutions to carry out substantive protection of the natural resources. So when we consider using offset measures to strengthen protected area management to attain maybe country-specific biodiversity conservation goals, or to attain biodiversity no-net loss goals, there are mainly four things that are of contestation, and that is additionality of the offset, equivalence in impact and offset areas, and permanency of the offset itself, and if at all, we have substantive social impacts to the communities surrounding both the impact and the offset areas. So in Uganda, we have a number of challenges, specifically lack of finances. And this is why some of these offsets have been permitted in developing countries, to ensure that we can restore protected areas, or ensure that they are managed in ways that, that enhance their integrity as conservation areas. So when we look at additionality, generally we have observed conservation benefits in the protected areas where offsetting has been done. However, we cannot say certainly that there is additionality. Maybe we could say there is tentative additionality. And I use this term due to the uncertainty of continuity of availability of funds. We know that offsets should ideally take place in perpetuity, but this is not something that we can be certain about. And that is because at times offset funding takes place either in the period that the development activities are taking place, or for a particular period of time, if it's simply providing funds and you've not secured an area entirely. So we have financing of institutions to carry out management, and there are so many activities that are being done. So you have sensitizing of communities, providing siblings to neighboring communities, and all this is to avoid pressure on these protected areas. And you have restoration activities taking place. You have boundary opening or boundary marking to avoid illegal activities or encroachment in protected areas. But we're not certain that this financing of the activities will carry on for so long or for an indefinite period of time. So we risk having this particular conservation benefits only in the period of time that financing is taking place. And thereafter, we're likely to see ourselves back in the same challenges that we already have. So you might find that for 5 or 10 years, you have the protected area, and after some years, you no longer have these activities funded, and thereafter, everything is drained. So it takes us back to the aspect that we might actually be simply slowing down the rate of biodiversity loss. By the end of it all, we might ultimately get back to that. When it comes to permanency, as I've said, we are not sure that we can ideally have the activities take place indefinitely. Among the main objectives of implementing offsets in protected areas is to ensure permanence of the protected area itself, as well as strengthen the management to reduce illegal activities to serve, so that the protected areas can serve their conservation purpose. But we are not sure if this will take place. And in some incidences, we have pressures that are socioeconomic, and we have also political pressures where some political leaders can actually ensure or can facilitate conversion of protected areas into private areas. And when we're not certain that the offset measure as it can reduce or can prevent these kinds of conversion that are politically motivated. So one would think that permanence would be ensured in these areas because you are certain of the institutional framework being there and ensuring that these activities will continuously go ahead. But these same institutions can still have these challenges catching up with them after that. When it comes to similarity, creating new protected areas you would probably not have exactly the same species or the same biodiversity that was being conserved. But if at all the protected area that is being restored or that is being strengthened is within vicinity of the impacted area, then you're more or less assured that you're going to have slightly the same biodiversity or the same communities that are impacted benefiting, and you're likely to have similar biodiversity and beneficiaries. But if at all it's not in vicinity, then it's going to be a challenge. For Uganda, most of the impacted areas were protected areas for which they were implementing offsets. So you have an electricity transmission line passing through a given forest, and the same forest is made as another portion of this forest is designated as an offset area. And in some cases, we had a full forestry ecosystem designated as a conservation area. And that also has a lot, it has a lot of implications, which I will not go into right now. Then we have the equivalence. I've talked about that you have high chances of attaining equivalence when the impact and offset sites are in vicinity. When it comes to social impacts, if at all we are having offsets in already protected areas, we have limited social impacts. And that is because you already have regulations restricting or having particular allocations or allowances. There's some kind of regulation already in place. So those regulations are expected to still hold and nothing really new coming in. And therefore, there will not be any shock, or people will not be displaced from their areas or from the lands they're already settling in. But it becomes different when you're acquiring new protected areas. That means you'll ideally have to bring in new regulations, and you have to either displace a number of people to ensure that you create these areas. So generally, one of the main risks that we're likely to face is the risk of lack of permanency and the risk of cost shifting, because when these offset funds are being provided to the government institutions, then the government might not ideally put in funds for managing these ecosystems or these protected areas because they're already having finances or they're already being financed. And also that could lead to perverse incentives. for example, we have some of the offset activities being funded by grants, with grants or donors giving in money, or you have other projects within the same ecosystem, the same catchment area, and then these projects are funding activities that are already offset activities in the same areas. So probably we could still have all these particular projects and activities taking place even if offsets were not there. So finally, what I could say is that offsets in protected areas are not necessarily in vain, though we have those particular risks, but I would look at it as a stepping stone for implementation, because we're not sure that these funds will be provided in perpetuity. So then the institutions are also going to look up for other projects, and this is giving or creating more opportunities for offsetting. So because they would need more funds to come in to keep maintaining these activities, and probably we are making the governments a little bit lame and thinking that they would actually, or making this as the opportune method or measure to attain more conservation funds. So that is the greatest challenge that we have there. But of course, offsets in this incidence are also simply slowing down biodiversity loss, but we can't really rule out the fact that we are losing biodiversity over time. But we can also take probably the benefit of it as a stepping stone as we look out for other conservation financing opportunities like payment for ecosystem service or RED Plus as the next measures that can be implemented to ensure that the offset activities can carry on when the offset projects or the offset funding has been stopped. Thank you very much. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Rita. Very interesting. I'd like to ask all our speakers to join us on screen now, and we'll deal with some of the questions that have come in. We've had several good, meaty, substantial questions. Okay, and that all worked. We're all here. So the first question is for you, Martine, and it goes back to your point, although I think maybe Rita might have touched on this as well, about the conflict or complementarity between voluntary activity and offsetting. This comes from Erica Chesko-Nolasco. Apologies for pronunciation. Do you see volunteering, citizen science, and environmental compensation working together? How could they be used in benefit to each other?
With a lot of transparency, I think that would be my main answer, because I see, I've seen examples where there are volunteers who are maybe turning up to a tree planting day or something, the sort of thing they often do under a lot of different, as part of different conservation programs in their area. But this particular tree planting day turns out to be tree planting as part of an offset for particular impact. And to me, that's essentially sort of appropriating their free labour without advising them that this is actually tree planting that was required legally to be done, and the company is getting it done for free. Now, maybe if they knew that, they still would say, yeah, well, that's fine, I don't really care. But maybe they would say, I could actually spend my Saturday planting trees in a different place, and those would be extra trees because you guys are still going to have to pay to get your trees planted. So I just think it's about, the key thing is the transparency, so everybody understands what part they're playing in the system.
Rita, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, if I could give an example that I've just given before of having a number of projects maybe interlinked or coordinating to boost biodiversity conservation measures, I would think taking into consideration the transparency that Martine is talking about, I think they can actually work together, because for us to ensure sustainability of the conservation measures, we also have to take into consideration that the main or the primary developers might not be able to carry out all these activities to the fullest. And given that even accountability of offsetting is an issue. We're not actually finding out whether, or we're not actually accounting for the benefits being equivalent to the losses. So I think we can have collaboration amongst a number of projects, though that will question the additionality. Of course, it will question it, but we can look at the shortfalls of the developers in funding offsets, and then we can fill up some because the offsets are there. And if at all the developers are not doing, or the expected outputs are not coming out, then we could have the other projects step in.
Great, thank you. David, we have a question directed at you, and I'm actually going to combine two questions here and maybe open it up to everybody, because I think it raises a very broad area for discussion. The particular answer for you, David, is that the current evidence standard for an offset in Canada is based on a protocol and a reasonable level of assurance audit. What standard are you proposing, scientific certainty? And related to that, I believe, also from Graham Gilchrist, to the panel, what type of weights and measures legislation would be required so that this new community has the same trading certainty as a bond or barley? So questions there about how we bring scientific certainty into this exchange relationship and the more complex relationships that we may need to develop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think I'd be able to answer the second part around bond markets. I don't understand them myself, but on the first, when we were exploring this in a variety of forums, we were talking about scientific certainty. And if you look at the way, you know, the Department of Fisheries and Ocean is probably the most advanced at a federal level on trying to do offsets in a successful way. They mostly, you know, the audits don't show that it's been successful. There's successful incidences of it, just not overall. But at least what they do is they do build that scientific certainty back up for the kind of offsets that could happen and try to build out essentially the knowledge of restoration and techniques to offset either mortality or loss of habitat. And so that's what I'm proposing, is that kind of scientific certainty. And that's what, you know, that's not all Pilgrim was referring to in 2013, but that's the base of that certainty. There's some other aspects to it. So I don't, you know, I guess in my presentation and in the discussions we've had, it's really around pointing out that when we're dealing with species at risk as opposed to common species, we really do have to meet a higher bar of certainty on the outcome of our offset, because we have a species that is on its way to extinction or extirpation from our country. And so we've got to set that bar a bit higher and find a way to do that. So I think people are open to how you come across, you know, how you quantify that certainty, but we were definitely thinking about it in the scientific sense. I can't comment on the other aspect of that.
Okay, I think the general theme here is at what level are the transaction costs of achieving scientific certainty and sort of the fine grain work that is needed to achieve that against sort of market efficiency as we try and exchange these different values. Pretty big question with a lot of implications, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I do have actually, I didn't have time to mention that in my talk, but so again, I go back to, and Martine pointed this out, so these kinds of laws, species at risk laws in particular, but other wetlands policies, these are meant to get in the way of business as usual development. That's the purpose, is to get in the way. And so they do get in the way. And they get in the way of very, very expensive things. In the Toronto region, they get in the way of hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. So I guess what I would propose, and my case there that I presented was red-side dace, is that let's say we spend $2 million on red-side dace, understanding its biology. Let's say we spend $10 million on it. And that allows us to come up with a regime of offsetting and other types of citizen and volunteer-based and community group action to move us toward recovery. Well, that seems like a pretty small drop in the bucket from a market efficiency point of view, that we spent even $5 million on red side dace biology and then facilitated, say, $2.5 billion in infrastructure development across the Greater Toronto Area, and it's off, you know, and not including its spin-off economic benefits. So these are usually not complicated questions, except when we get into remote areas where costs are extremely high and biology is largely unknown. But that'd be my answer to that question.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Carolyn Campbell. It's directed to Martine, although she invites others to chime in if they wish. Please discuss target-based offsets more. For example, enforceable limits on buffered disturbance, which decline rather than increase, or stay flat over time in a range, needed to improve avoidance and give mitigation policies teeth. A lot of components in there.
Oh yeah, thanks. I'm not sure that I've completely absorbed all of those, but yeah, look, I think that the target-based approach is it's still susceptible to a lot of the risks that we've talked about around offsets, but it does actually deal with some of them. So some of the issues around additionality and counterfactuals and the extent to which that can be gained and the different outcomes you actually achieve, all depending on what assumption you make about your counterfactual, all of that messy stuff, which does lead to a lot of argument and confusion, is sort of gone in the based approach, because you're essentially being clear about what state you want to achieve. Just as David was describing, you know, what do you want? What is a recovered state, for example, which is the desired outcome you want to see for your species or your ecosystem? There may be different targets that would translate to different numerical, like population sizes, extent of distribution, etc., for different species. But then for anything that chips away at what's left for that species, the counterbalancing work that they would have to do to stay on track to moving to the target is going to be proportional to where you want to get to. So it's really about, instead of just looking at an impact and an offset in isolation, it's about how does this, it sort of goes to the first question as well, it's about how does this fit in with all of the other efforts that are being done and with where we want to get to. It's a much more positive way of looking at things.
Okay, great, thank you. I see we're getting a little tight on time. We'll try and squeeze in one more question. And we may be able to extend our time for a few minutes if all our speakers are willing to do that. Our next question comes from Shomo Ghosh, again, directed to Martine. As you mentioned, offsets can cause system distortions. Can cultural norms anchored in ecosystems be mobilized to act as non-finance-based incentive mechanisms?
Ask it, please.
Sure. Can cultural norms anchored to ecosystems be mobilized to act as non-finance-based incentive mechanisms to achieve offsets?
Now I have to think that through. So cultural norms are so important in what actually happens out there, and offsets generally capture a relatively small amount of the things that are going on. So the stuff that's driving landscape change and population change, at this point anyway, it's not offsets, it's a whole lot of different things. And most of that is driven by those norms. And so the extent to which offsets might nudge those norms in an undesirable direction is actually perhaps more influential than the way we design the offsets themselves, which is why I'm increasingly worried about that. Now, I'm not sure I've got the full details of the question because I was just startled by someone appearing in my office, but I hope that that's helpful.
Okay, thanks, Martine. Would anybody else like to offer some thoughts on that? No? Okay. We're just about at the end of our time. As I say, the platform here will allow us a little bit of a grace period to continue the discussion. But as we're coming to the end of our scheduled time, I would like to make a few closing comments for those are going to have to leave us. And also I'd like to request our participants' feedback and assistance in presenting coming sessions in this series. First of all, I'd like to thank all of today's speakers for getting our series off to a very interesting and engaging start. Thanks to Martine, David, Celine, and Rita. And I should make note here that Martine is having a very early morning in order to join us, and Celine and Rita are having a very late night, so special thanks there. Secondly, I'd like to thank our partners and sponsors, Alberta Innovates, the Government of Canada Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, ConocoPhillips Canada, and Tech. And I would also like to direct your attention to the polls on the upper right side of your screen. We have two sets of questions for you. First, under the polls tab in the upper right of the stage screen, there are questions about the use of sessions on the future. The sessions feature on the Hop-In platform. This is a feature that allows us to set up smaller informal group discussions that might be used to drill down on particular ideas, to debrief on our main presentations, or to make new contacts and simply exchange ideas. We have not arranged such sessions today, but would be happy to do so if we hear from you, the participants, that these would be useful to you. Again, a question about that is available on the polls tab. Secondly, we have a survey asking for your feedback on many aspects of today's event. Please click on How Did We Do on the upper right of the stage screen. And we would appreciate you taking the time to complete the survey to help us see what has gone right and what can be done better. It's not too late for us to make adjustments for later sessions in this series based on your feedback. Finally, if you've not already done so, I encourage you to check out and register for the remaining sessions in this 8-part series. A week today, we will be focusing on the topic No Net Loss in a Changing Landscape, that will pick up many of the themes that were introduced today. And we will be joined by Fabien Quetier, Marianne Weber, Eric Higgs, and Florence Famians. Again, thank you to all of you for attending today's sessions. But don't go away if you don't have to, because we have time to continue the discussion with our speakers. I believe typically the platform allows us a grace period of approximately 12 to 15 minutes, at which point it will automatically boot us out. So I just give that as a warning that if your screen suddenly ends, it's not that we have gotten high-handed or it's a mistake, it is beyond our control. But let's dig in here with some questions. So question for Rita. Has there been discussion over having companies create trust funds so that the offsets are financed in perpetuity?
Well, there have been those discussions, but however, they have not yet actually pulled through. So they're still discussing on actually who should host the fund. Should it be one of the national environmental management authorities, or should it be a private or a CSO to ensure that there is more accountability? But it is not yet certain, and that is because there are still a number of, I would call them political challenges, because the developing countries are more pro-development, and that is what they prioritize as opposed to conservation. So one of the challenges we're facing is that there's a bit of giving leeway to development partners as long as the development goes through and the government is being part of these developments as the developer himself. So being that government is the developer, it brings in a little bit of complexity in actually financing the offset. So all these discussions are wavering there because the government does not want, they call it frustrating developments.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. A question from Ryan Edwards. He is looking for your opinions on the counterintuitive idea that offsets can be used to improve situations in net gain contexts where sustainability thresholds or limits have been crossed in developing world contexts. I'll repeat that. It's so opinions on the counterintuitive idea that offsets can be used to improve situations in net gain contexts where sustainability thresholds and limits have been crossed in developing world contexts. Anybody like to take that on?
I'll jump in just to say very briefly that that's the sort of thing that hypothetically you can design, you can use a target-based approach to achieve. So recognizing, and this is essentially, it's not just developing world context. Basically, if we've got a threatened species, if it's threatened, that's probably because it's already crossed the threshold. It's below where it needs to be. And so you actually need your target to essentially be a net gain target in absolute terms. Now, technically that's possible as long as you can do actions to achieve that recovery, or if it's something that is actually restorable. And you simply would need then to require for each further unit of loss, a gain several times that loss in its size. But of course, the ecological limitations kick in, where for the species for which you could actually achieve that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, David.
Yeah, I'd just say, I mean, my developing world experience is mainly in Indonesia, but I would say, you know, I can envision it. I was mostly working on coastal ecosystems there, and I don't know how you would practically apply it, but you could, a lot of the coral reef destruction there is due to land-based sources of pollution. There's other threats and many factors involved, but on the land-based sources, you could imagine designing, at least, implementing would be a different situation, but a net gain scenario where you're using multipliers. So as you do things on the land that are going to result in some sedimentation or outputs into the ocean, you're solving probably through mangrove replantation and other types of plantings and land stabilization many times the impact. And so you try and move that landscape over time. And of course, you're going to run up against limits. For example, if you tried to do this in Java, there's just a lot of people using a lot of land, but there might be opportunities for that kind of thing, even in a developing world. I would just say that even in the developed world in Canada, we're not particularly good at designing that exact scenario where we're making these offsets work as a net gain for us. So it's a challenge.
Thank you. Okay, and I'll just see what's come in. Maybe it's a good point a good contentious point to end on. There's an early comment that given, since we can't make more, is an offset requirement really just another word for a development tax? I'm tempted to leap in on this myself, but I'll hold my tongue, at least at the beginning.
Well, I think it's not really a tax. It's more like a cap and trade approach is me the way I think about offsets rather than a tax, because the net outcome is what's fixed. And you pay whatever it costs to achieve that outcome, which is a slightly different way of looking at it. But the fact that we can't make more land is going to set limits to how far we can push this whole thing. And what happens then becomes the next question.
Yeah. I think the way I generally think about this is it's not so much a tax as it is a reallocation of cost. It's a cost away from the public toward the developer or the activity and interest that is causing the disturbance. We have a question just come in from John Mahoney. Offsets need to be effective for the duration of a project, essentially in perpetuity. How can we build the long-term requirement into the offset? Rita, are you?
I can try to attempt. I can try to attempt that. When it comes to desiring a long term, as in perpetuity, I think that is a tall order that might actually not be obtained. But what I can share, if those interested could look at how the Kalagala offset project is being carried out, because knowing that funds might not be there, they have tried to interlink this offset project with other ongoing projects at a ministerial or institutional management level, the National Forestry or the Ministry of Water and Environment. And that is to ensure that even without the funds, you can have the activities designed in the offset to carry on after the project phases out, as the funding of the project phases out. So that enables the continuity of the catchment management without necessarily project funds being there.
Okay. All right, David.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's interesting when you start looking at specific species and how it would work for them, because, you know, some species are quite, I mean, birds are quite dynamic. They need the habitat present somewhere, but they can move between it. So the idea of permanency for a bobolink, for example, which is a grassland species that we have in Ontario and Quebec and parts of the US, is an interesting one, because you don't necessarily have to have the habitat in the same place all the time forever. You need to have an amount of habitat on the landscape in the right conformation forever. And that allows you, so bobolink was in my slides because I think it's a species that, I mean, people are, in a sense, doing offsets for bobolink, and it kind of lends itself to figuring out how to make it work. So I think there's some nuances to what permanency means depending on what animal and habitat you're actually talking about as well.
Okay. All right, well, I think we are pushing the limits of our luck here, and we seems to have covered most of the questions. So I am going to close us down for today. Again, invite all of our participants and all of you, our speakers, to join us next week for talking about no net loss in a changing environment. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for their participation today. I think it's been a great session despite the minor technical glitches that we handled with aplomb with Kathleen's help. So thank you.